The stars above Terra flickered, not with the sacred light of the Astronomicon, but with something else, a wrongness that made even the most battle-hardened Astartes pause in their vigils. In the upper atmosphere, reality tore like wet parchment, and through that wound fell a figure wreathed in red, white, and blue. No drop pod cushioned his descent. No grav chute slowed his fall. He simply descended, arms crossed, cape billowing behind him like a banner of false divinity. When he struck the surface of the throne world, the impact shattered Ferrocrete and sent shockwaves rippling through the underhive. Alarms shrieked in a dozen dialects. Servitors collapsed mid-prayer, their machine spirits overwhelmed by the sheer electromagnetic distortion radiating from the crater. And when the dust cleared, a man stood, tall, blonde, perfect, his suit immaculate despite the violence of a rival. His eyes glowed faintly blue, scanning the grey wasteland with barely concealed disgust. "What the hell is this dump?" Homelander muttered, his voice carrying an edge of petulant rage. He lifted off the ground effortlessly, hovering above the crater as crowds began to gather. Laborers, pilgrims, the wretched masses of Terra's endless hive, all stared upward in confusion and awe. Some fell to their knees instinctively, mistaking him for an angel of the Emperor. Others fled, sensing something fundamentally wrong in his presence. Homelander's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's right," he said, louder now, his voice amplified by sheer will. "Kneel. You should be grateful. You're looking at perfection." He descended slowly, boots touching scorched earth, and straightened his cape with theatrical precision. Around him, the crowd trembled, not from reverence, but from the predatory intensity radiating from his gaze. Within the Imperial Palace, augur arrays screamed warnings. Tech priests chanted Binharic hymns of confusion as data streams contradicted themselves. The anomaly registered as human, baseline human, even, yet the energy readings were impossible. No warp signature, no genetic modification, no blessings of the Omnissiah, just raw power, contained within flesh that should not be capable of containing it. Captain Archon Valorous of the Adeptus Custodes received the report with grim silence. He had stood guard over the Emperor for 3 centuries, had seen demons claw at reality and traitor Astartes batter the palace gates. But this felt different, wrong. He donned his helm and summoned his brothers. "Something has violated the sanctity of Terra," he said simply. "We end it." Down in the hive, Homelander was growing impatient. The crowds weren't cheering. They weren't screaming his name or begging for autographs. They just stared, hollow-eyed and exhausted. "What's wrong with you people?" he snapped, heat flickering behind his eyes. "I said kneel." One man, too slow or too brave, remained standing. Homelander's gaze fixed on him, and for an instant, the air shimmered with lethal intent. But before the heat vision could fire, a golden figure landed between them with enough force to crack the street. The custodian rose slowly, halberd gleaming, his presence radiating an authority that transcended flesh. Homelander blinked, momentarily taken aback. "What the hell are you supposed to be? Some kind of Roman cosplayer?" The custodian's voice was a low rumble, amplified by his helm's vox grill. You stand upon holy ground, intruder. Identify yourself, or be destroyed." Homelander laughed, a sharp, brittle sound devoid of real humor. "Destroyed? By you?" He floated upward again, eye level with the towering warrior. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm Homelander. I'm the strongest, the smartest, the best, and nobody threatens me." The Custodian said nothing. He simply raised his halberd, the weapon humming with ancient power. Around them, more golden figures descended from gunships, forming a perimeter. Citizens scattered, knowing that when the Emperor's chosen walked, death followed. Homelander's smile widened, but his eyes betrayed something else, a flicker of uncertainty, quickly smothered by narcissistic rage. "Fine," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see how tough you really are." He moved first, a blur of speed and arrogance, fist cocked back for a punch that had shattered steel and pulverized bone. The Custodian sidestepped with preternatural grace, halberd sweeping in a perfect arc. Homelander barely twisted in time, the blade's edge scoring across his suit and drawing a thin line of blood across his ribs. He gasped, not from pain, but from shock. He bled. For the first time in years, he actually bled. Rage exploded through him. "You cut me!" His eyes flared crimson, and twin beams of superheated energy lanced toward the Custodian. The warrior's storm shield snapped up, absorbing the blast in a shower of sparks, but the sheer heat forced him back a step. Homelander pressed the advantage, heat vision carving through ferrocrete and servitors alike. Bodies exploded into ash. Civilians screamed. The Custodian's voice cut through the chaos, cold and final. "You are no god. You are a petulant child with stolen power." He lunged forward, halberd thrust with precision, born of millennia. Homelander caught the shaft mid-strike, his hands smoking from the weapon's energy field, and hurled the Custodian backward through a building. For a moment, silence. Homelander floated above the carnage, breathing hard, blood trickling down his side. Around him, the hive burned, and in the distance, more golden figures approached, dozens of them, moving with synchronized lethality. Above, warships turned their guns toward the surface, and the air thickened with targeting lasers. Homelander's expression shifted from triumph to something uglier, fear. Not of death, but of rejection. These people weren't worshipping him, they were trying to kill him. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No, I'm a hero. I'm your hero." Heat vision swept across the skyline, carving through spires and gun emplacements. Explosions blossomed like deadly flowers. Deep beneath the palace, the Emperor stirred. For 10,000 years, he had endured in silence, but now his vast consciousness brushed against the intruder's mind and recoiled. Here was power, yes, but it was hollow, a black hole of need and insecurity, wrapped in flesh that mimicked divinity but possessed none of its grace. The Emperor saw Homelander completely. A broken thing, given strength but never wisdom, adoration but never love. And in that moment, the Emperor made a decision. He whispered a single word into the Imperium, and reality shuddered. Across Terra, every psychic sensitive collapsed, screaming one phrase: False idol, purge it. Homelander hovered above the burning hive, chest heaving, blood and ash smeared across his perfect face. Below, the Custodians regrouped. Above, the sky darkened with warships. And somewhere in the depths of his unraveling mind, Homelander felt something he had never truly known. The cold certainty that he was not, and had never been, the hero of this story. The true reckoning was only beginning. The sky above Terra bled crimson as warships aligned their bombardment cannons. Targeting solutions scrolled across 1,000 data slates, each one locked upon the floating figure whose cape snapped in the ash-choked wind. Homelander's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath misting in the superheated air. Blood, his blood, dripped from the shallow cut across his ribs, each drop a damning testament to his mortality. "I'm bleeding," he whispered, staring at his crimson-stained fingers. "I'm actually bleeding." The disbelief in his voice curdled into fury. He looked up at the warships, at the golden warriors regrouping below, at the terrified masses cowering in the rubble. "You made me bleed!" His roar shattered windows across 3 city blocks. The Custodians did not respond with words. They responded with war. Bolter rounds the size of human fists screamed through the air, each one a prayer and a death sentence. Homelander moved, faster than human eyes could track, but not fast enough. One round clipped his shoulder, exploding against his invulnerable skin with enough force to spin him sideways. He snarled, heat vision lancing outward in wild arcs, melting stone and flesh without discrimination. Captain Archon Valorous rose from the rubble, his auramite armor scorched but intact. He watched the intruder with the cold assessment of a predator studying wounded prey. "He bleeds," Archon said into the Vox. "He feels pain. He can die." Around him, his brothers formed a killing pattern. Ancient tactics perfected over 10 millennia, designed to bring down everything from greater demons to traitor Primarchs. Homelander saw them moving, saw the noose tightening, and something inside him snapped. "I don't die," he screamed. "I'm Homelander. I'm the Homelander." He slammed into the nearest Custodian with the force of an orbital strike, driving the warrior through layers of ferrocrete and into the bedrock below. The impact crater glowed with residual heat, but the Custodian was already moving, halberd sweeping upward even as his armor sparked and groaned. The blade caught Homelander across the face, a perfect strike that would have decapitated a mortal. Instead, it left a shallow gash across his cheek, another impossible wound, another crack in the facade of invincibility. Homelander shrieked and unleashed his heat vision point blank, the beams boring into the Custodian's chest plate. For 3 seconds, the warrior held. His armor blackened, then cracked, then finally gave way. He fell, his last breath a prayer to the Emperor. Homelander stood over the corpse, panting, his face twisted in victorious rage. "That's right. That's what happens when you challenge me. I'm a god." "No." The voice came from behind him, calm and absolute. Homelander spun to find 12 more Custodians standing in perfect formation, their halberds raised in unison. Beyond them, the skies darkened further as Adeptus Astartes drop pods began their descent. Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, Black Templars, all converging on the heretic who dared defile the throne world. Homelander's eyes widened. How many of you are there? He launched himself skyward, seeking escape, but lance strikes from orbiting warships forced him back down. Each beam was a pillar of light that turned stone to glass and air to plasma. He dodged, twisted, flew in erratic patterns, but the Imperium's guns were designed to kill continent-sized warships. Evasion was temporary. One strike grazed him, and he felt his skin blister. Another forced him into a building, and he crashed through 50 floors before arresting his momentum. When he emerged, his suit was torn, his hair disheveled, and his face, that perfect, smiling face, was contorted with genuine terror masked as rage. "Stop shooting at me!" he howled, heat vision sweeping across the sky in a desperate attempt to blind the targeting arrays. It was futile. For every Auspex he destroyed, 10 more locked on. The Imperium of man was vast beyond comprehension, and he had made himself its singular focus. Down in the ruins, Inquisitor Erastes Vale watched through Magnoc Ulas, his expression unreadable. "What is he?" his adjutant asked. Vale was silent for a long moment. "A cautionary tale," he said finally. "Power without purpose. Strength without sacrifice. He is what the Emperor could have become had he been born mortal and weak." The adjutant frowned. "Weak, my lord. He's destroying our forces." "No," Vale corrected. "He's surviving. There's a difference." He gestured to the battlefield where Homelander darted between attacks, his movements growing more frantic, more defensive. "He has no strategy, no allies, no goal beyond his own preservation. He's already lost. He simply hasn't realized it yet." Homelander heard none of this. He was too focused on the 3 Astartes Terminators that had teleported directly into his path, their storm bolters roaring. He caught one in midair and hurled him into a manufactorum, then turned his heat vision on the second. The warrior's armor held for 2 seconds before melting through, the Space Marine inside dying with a hymn on his lips. But the third Terminator closed the distance, his power fist crackling with barely contained energy. He swung, and Homelander raised his arms to block. A mistake. The power fist connected with his forearm, and bone cracked. Homelander screamed, a sound of pure animal agony, and head-butted the Terminator with enough force to crumple the warrior's helmet. Both fell, one dead, the other cradling his arm in disbelief. "I'm broken," Homelander gasped, staring at the unnatural angle of his forearm. No, this doesn't happen to me." He tried to straighten it, and the pain nearly caused him to vomit. Around him, the Imperium's forces closed in, a tide of gold and ceramite and holy wrath. High above, in orbit, a single word was transmitted from the Imperial Palace to every vessel in range. "Exterminatus authorization pending. Prepare cyclonic torpedoes." Vale heard the transmission and closed his eyes. To destroy Terra, even a small section, was unthinkable. But so was allowing a being of Homelander's instability to endure. "The Emperor protects," he whispered, "even when protection demands sacrifice." Homelander felt the shift in the air, the gathering of apocalyptic energies above. His superhuman senses picked up the radiation signatures of weapons that could crack worlds. And for the first time in his existence, he understood what it meant to be small, to be insignificant, to be nothing. He looked down at the people still cowering in the ruins, the same people he'd expected to worship him. They stared back with hollow eyes, eyes that had seen demons and xenos and traitors beyond counting. To them, he was just another monster, another Tuesday. "No," Homelander said, his voice breaking. "This isn't how it's supposed to go. I'm the hero. I save people. They're supposed to love me." He rose into the air, arms spread wide, blood dripping from his wounds. "Love me," he commanded, his voice echoing across the hive. No one moved. No one cheered. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, something inside Homelander shattered beyond repair. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before Homelander's mind bent inward, collapsing under the weight of a rejection too profound for his fractured psyche to process. His mouth opened, not in speech, but in a primal howl, wordless, endless, the sound of a god realizing it was never divine. The air around him shimmered as heat poured from his eyes in uncontrolled bursts, carving random scars across the cityscape. Below, the Custodians held formation, watching with the patience of immortals. They had seen madness before, chaos, corruption, warp taint, the gibbering insanity of those who stared too long into the Imperium. But this was different. This was a creature collapsing, not because something entered it, but because nothing ever had. He was hollow, and the void was finally showing. Captain Arkan raised his hand, signaling his brothers to hold. "Let him exhaust himself," he commanded through the vox. "Rage is finite, even his." Around him, the Custodians remained motionless, golden statues bearing witness to a breakdown that would have been pathetic if it weren't so dangerous. Homelander's heat vision swept across a pilgrim district, and stone basilicas melted like wax. Thousands died in seconds, their bodies flash vaporized before they could scream. He didn't even see them. His vision was turned inward, replaying every slight, every failure, every moment he'd needed someone, and they'd looked away. "I'm perfect," he gasped between ragged breaths. "I'm perfect. Why don't you see that?" From orbit, Inquisitor Vale watched the massacre and made his decision. "Fire Solution Delta 7, he said quietly. "Non-cyclonic, focused lance strike. Minimize collateral damage." His adjutant hesitated. "My lord, he's still moving." "I know," Vale interrupted, "but he's predictable now. Broken things always are." The lance strike descended like the finger of an angry god, a column of light so bright it turned night to noon for 300 kilometers. Homelander saw it coming, too late. He tried to move, but his broken arm threw off his balance and the beam caught him fully. For an instant, he was the center of a miniature sun, his body silhouetted in nuclear fire. When the light faded, he was falling. Smoke rose from his charred suit, his skin blistered and blackened in patches, his regeneration struggled to address. He hit the ground with a wet crunch, cratering the earth, and lay there gasping. For 10 seconds, he didn't move. Then, impossibly, he began to rise. "Why won't you die?" Arkan said, more curious than frustrated. He approached slowly, halberd held loosely, studying the crawling figure like a Margot's biologist examining a specimen. Homelander looked up, one eye swollen shut, blood leaking from his ears. "Because," he slurred, "I'm the Homelander. I can't." He collapsed again, coughing red. The custodian knelt beside him, massive even in repose. "You are a weapon without a war," he said softly. "A tool that believes itself a craftsman. In another universe, perhaps you would have been formidable. Here, you are merely tragic." He raised his halberd. "The Emperor's mercy be upon you." "Wait." The voice cut through the moment like a knife. Not loud, but absolute. Every custodian froze. Every servitor ceased motion. Even the wind seemed to still. From the shadows of a ruined chapel, a figure emerged, robed, gaunt, his face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to drink light. When he spoke again, the words carried harmonics that bypassed ears and spoke directly to the soul. "This one is not for you to end." Arkan rose, halberd still raised. "Identify yourself." The robed figure laughed, a sound like dry leaves over graves. "I am no one of consequence, noble custodian, merely an observer of patterns. And this one," he gestured toward Homelander's broken form. "This one has a pattern most curious. He is empty, yes, but emptiness can be filled." "Heresy," Arkan said flatly. "Step back or be destroyed." The robed man tilted his head. "Is it heresy to see potential where others see waste? Your emperor was a man before he was a god. Perhaps this creature simply needs education." He raised one skeletal hand and the air bent. Not warp sorcery. The custodians would have felt that immediately. This was something older, something that predated the distinction between materium and immaterium. Homelander gasped as invisible threads wrapped around him, pulling him upright like a puppet. His eyes, unfocused and glazed, stared at nothing. The robed figure approached, circling him slowly. So much power, wasted on self-worship. So much potential, squandered on validation. He leaned close, whispering words that slithered like oil. "But you could be more. You could be necessary." "Who are you?" Homelander croaked, the first coherent words he'd managed in minutes. The robed man smiled beneath his hood. "I am the whisper between seconds. I am the doubt that cracks faith. I am the voice that asks, what if you were never enough?" He stepped back, releasing his hold. Homelander collapsed, but now his eyes held focus. And something worse, understanding. Arkan moved, halberd descending in a killing arc. The robed man didn't dodge, didn't need to. The blade passed through him like smoke, finding no resistance, no flesh. "You cannot kill what was never alive, custodian," the figure said pleasantly. "But please, do try again." "I find the futility amusing." Before Arkan could strike once more, the ground erupted. Not with violence, but with geometry. Symbols that hurt to perceive, angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The custodians staggered, their perfect discipline momentarily disrupted by sensory input their minds rejected. And in that instant of disorientation, the robed figure and Homelander vanished. When clarity returned, Arkan found himself staring at empty ground. The only evidence of their presence was a scorch mark in the shape of an 8-pointed star, a symbol so profane that even seeing it required immediate purification rites. He turned to his brothers. "Seal this district, burn everything within 3 kilometers, then forget you saw it." "Brother Captain," one custodian ventured. "What was that entity?" Arkan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even his immortal kin uneasy. "A recruiter," he said finally. "And we have just lost a weapon to the enemy." Far from Terra, in a place that was everywhere and nowhere, Homelander awoke on a floor of obsidian mirrors. His wounds were gone, his suit immaculate, even his broken arm restored. He sat up slowly, disoriented, and found the robed figure watching him from a throne of screaming faces. "Welcome," the figure said, "to the place where gods are made and broken. Welcome to opportunity." Homelander stared at his reflection in the black floor, at the fear in his own eyes, the weakness he'd always denied. "What do you want from me?" The robed man's smile widened impossibly. "I want to give you what you've always craved, Homelander. I want to make you truly perfect, truly loved, truly necessary." He extended a skeletal hand. "All you have to do is take it." And in the darkness between stars, something ancient and patient began to laugh. The obsidian chamber stretched endlessly in all directions, or perhaps it was only 3 meters wide and the dimensions simply refused to remain consistent. Homelander stood slowly, his boots clicking against the mirror-like floor with sounds that echoed wrong, arriving before they should and lingering after they'd passed. His reflection stared back at him, but it moved with a delay, wearing expressions he hadn't made yet. "Where the hell am I?" he demanded, his voice carrying more bravado than confidence. The robed figure remained seated on his throne of anguish, fingers steepled beneath his hood. "You are in the space between thoughts," he replied. "The pause between heartbeats. The moment of doubt that separates decision from action. You are, quite literally, nowhere that matters, which makes it the perfect place for us to speak honestly." Homelander's jaw tightened. Honesty. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. His whole life had been a performance, a carefully maintained illusion of perfection. Honesty meant weakness, vulnerability, all the things he'd spent decades burying beneath layers of narcissism and violence. "I don't need to speak honestly with some freak in a bathrobe," he snarled. "Send me back. I'll finish what I started." "Will you?" The robed figure tilted his head, and beneath the hood, Homelander glimpsed something that might have been eyes, or might have been holes where eyes should be, filled with distant, screaming stars. "You'll return to Terra and face the Custodians again, the orbital bombardments, the endless armies of 1,000,000 worlds, all converging on you." He laughed softly. "You lasted 20 minutes, Homelander, and you were losing." The words hit harder than any lance strike. Homelander's fists clenched, his jaw working as rage and shame warred for dominance. I wasn't losing. I was just outmatched, the figure finished. Overwhelmed, exposed, all the things you fear most made manifest, and worse, ignored. They didn't worship you. They didn't fear you. They simply processed you. Identified the threat. Allocated resources, began the extermination protocol. You were bureaucracy to them, Homelander, a form to be filed and forgotten. Homelander's heat vision flared involuntarily, crimson light flooding the chamber. The robed figure didn't flinch. The beams struck him and simply stopped, hanging in the air like frozen rain before dissipating into mist. Temper tantrums won't serve you here, the figure said mildly. This is neutral ground, a place of negotiation. Negotiation? Homelander barked a bitter laugh. What could you possibly offer me? A participation trophy? A "you tried" sticker? He turned away, arms crossed, cape settling around his shoulders. But his reflection in the floor caught his eye, and he froze. Because his reflection wasn't mimicking him anymore. It was kneeling, head bowed, weeping silently. I can offer you what you truly want, the robed figure said, rising from his throne. He moved with a gliding motion, feet never quite touching the ground. Not power. You have that already. Not strength or speed or invulnerability. You're drowning in those. He circled Homelander slowly, a predator assessing wounded prey. No, what you want is simpler and infinitely more expensive. And what's that? Homelander whispered, still staring at his broken reflection. The robed figure leaned close, his breath cold against Homelander's ear. Purpose. The word landed like a hammer. Homelander's breath caught, his perfect facade cracking just slightly. I have purpose, he said, but the words came out hollow. I'm a hero. I save people. You perform, the figure interrupted. You posture. You collect adoration like a drunkard collects bottles, knowing each one will leave you emptier than the last. Because you're not saving people, Homelander. You're saving the image of yourself. And images can't be loved. Only surfaces can be admired. Homelander spun, grabbing the robed figure by his collar, or trying to. His hands passed through fabric that felt like cobwebs and permafrost, finding no purchase. Who the hell do you think you are? He roared, his voice cracking. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. Don't I? The figure's voice shifted, multiplying, becoming a chorus of whispers that came from everywhere and nowhere. Raised in a laboratory, tested, measured, told you were special while being treated as a specimen, taught to smile while your handlers took notes on your emotional responses, given everything except the one thing that would have made you human, genuine connection. The whispers coalesced back into a single voice. Oh, Homelander, I know you better than you know yourself. Homelander staggered back, his breathing ragged. Memories flashed unbidden. The white rooms, the observation windows, the doctors with their clipboards and cold eyes. The approval that always came with conditions. The love that was always transactional. Shut up, he hissed. Shut up! They made you to be perfect, the figure continued relentlessly, and in doing so, made you incapable of growth, because perfection, by definition, cannot improve. You are complete, finished, a closed system, unable to evolve. And that's why you're failing now. The universe you've entered doesn't care about perfection. It cares about endurance, about adaptation, about warriors who grow stronger through suffering, not beings who shatter the moment their invincibility is questioned. Homelander's legs gave out. He sank to his knees, staring at his trembling hands. "What do you want from me?" he asked again, but this time the question carried desperation instead of defiance. The robed figure knelt before him, meeting his eyes, and now Homelander could see clearly what lay beneath the hood. Nothing. A void so absolute it made the space between galaxies seem crowded. "I want to give you a choice," the figure said gently. "Return to Terra. Face the Imperium's wrath. Die screaming, unmourned, your existence a footnote in their endless war. Or—" He extended his hand again, and this time Homelander saw it clearly. The flesh was pale, translucent, with something writhing beneath the skin. Fingers that were too long, too many jointed, tipped with nails that gleamed like black glass. "Or," Homelander whispered. The figure smiled with a mouth that had too many teeth. "Or embrace what you truly are. Not a hero, not a god, but a weapon. The Imperium understands weapons, Homelander. They worship them. They pray to them. They give them names and histories and purposes. Join them. Become their sword. And in return, you'll have what you always wanted. A place where you're not just tolerated, but necessary." "Join them?" Homelander's laugh was brittle, fractured. "They tried to kill me." "Of course they did. You arrived on their holiest world, killed their citizens, attacked their guardians. You were a threat." The figure's grip tightened, and now Homelander could feel it, cold seeping into his bones. But threats, once neutralized, can become assets. The Imperium has a long history of binding monsters to its service. All you must do is submit. There it was, the word that made Homelander's stomach clench. Submit. The thing he'd sworn he'd never do, the ultimate surrender of self. "I don't submit to anyone," he growled. The figure's smile widened impossibly. "Then die. Choose, Homelander. Die free and forgotten, or live bound and beloved. There is no third option." Homelander stared at the offered hand, at the void eyes watching him with patient hunger. In the obsidian floor, his reflection still knelt, still wept, and slowly, hating himself with every fiber of his being, he reached out and took the hand. The cold that engulfed him was absolute, drowning, suffocating. He opened his mouth to scream, and darkness poured in. When consciousness returned, he was standing on Terra again, but everything had changed. The sky was darker. The air tasted of copper and ash, and floating before him were the Custodians, halberds raised, eyes unreadable behind golden helms. But this time, Homelander didn't attack. He lowered his head, just slightly, just enough, and spoke two words he'd never imagined saying. "I yield." The Custodians did not lower their weapons, but they didn't advance either. And in that frozen moment, the galaxy's balance shifted by a single, terrible degree. The Custodians remained motionless, their golden forms like statues carved from the Emperor's will made manifest. Homelander knelt in the ash-choked street, head bowed just enough to signify submission without breaking him entirely. His fists clenched against the rubble, nails digging into stone that crumbled beneath the pressure. Every instinct screamed at him to rise, to fight, to incinerate these arrogant toy soldiers and prove his dominance. But the memory of the lance strike burning through his flesh, the broken bone, the helplessness, it held him like chains. Captain Archon Valorous studied the kneeling figure for a long, silent moment. His enhanced senses catalogued every micro-expression, every tension in Homelander's muscles, searching for deception. What he found was worse than hostility, desperation, the kind that made cornered animals unpredictable. "You yield," Archon repeated, his voice flat. "To what purpose?" Homelander's jaw worked. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. I want to help. I can help you. I'm strong. He swallowed. I can be useful. The admission cost him something fundamental. His hands trembled slightly, hidden from view beneath his cape. Useful, Archon mused. He turned to his brothers, speaking in thoughtmark, the silent battle language of the Custodians conveyed through minute gestures imperceptible to outsiders. The conversation lasted 3 seconds. Consensus was reached. Archon turned back to Homelander. "Stand." Homelander rose slowly, warily, like a beaten dog expecting another blow. The Custodians formed a circle around him, not threatening, but inescapable. Archon stepped forward until they were nearly chest to chest, the captain's golden armor reflecting Homelander's haggard face. "The Emperor's mercy is infinite," Archon said quietly. "His judgment is absolute. You have trespassed upon holy ground, murdered his faithful, and attacked his guardians. The punishment for such crimes is death without exception." Homelander's breath caught. Here it comes, he thought. The rejection, the end, just like always. But Archon continued. "However, the Emperor is also pragmatic. If you speak truth, if you genuinely seek purpose in service, then your fate will be determined by one who sees infinitely further than we do." He gestured toward the Imperial Palace, its Gothic spires piercing the smog-filled sky. "You will stand before the throne, and he will judge you." The blood drained from Homelander's face. "The throne?" Archon's expression remained unreadable behind his helm. "You will face the Emperor of mankind. If he finds worth in you, you live. If not..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Homelander nodded jerkily, not trusting his voice. The Custodians closed formation around him, and the procession began. They walked through the ruins of the Hive district, past the bodies of those Homelander had killed in his tantrum. Civilians emerged from hiding to watch the procession, their faces hollow with grief and exhaustion. Some spat at Homelander as he passed. Others simply stared, their eyes carrying accusations heavier than words. He forced himself to look straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. A child, no more than 6, covered in dust and dried blood, stepped into their path. The Custodians halted immediately, weapons ready but not raised. The child stared up at Homelander with eyes far too old for her face. "My mama's gone," she said simply. "Did you take her?" Homelander's throat constricted. He wanted to deny it, to explain that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant. But the words died unspoken. Because he had meant it. In that moment of rage, he'd wanted them to hurt as badly as he did. He croaked. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, pathetic. The child's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the ruins. Homelander stood frozen until Arkan's gauntlet pressed against his back, urging him forward. "That," the Custodian said softly, "is what you must carry. Every death, every scream. It is the price of power. Learn to bear it or drown beneath it." The inner gates of the Imperial Palace opened silently, revealing corridors vast enough to swallow cathedrals. Servitors lined the walls, their mechanical eyes tracking Homelander's every movement. Somewhere in the distance, choirs sang hymns in languages that predated human civilization. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with 10,000 years of prayer and bloodshed. They descended, down through layers of sanctified stone and adamantium, past vaults containing relics that could destroy solar systems, through checkpoints where each custodian submitted to gene scans and psychic probe. Homelander felt the weight increasing with every step, not physical weight, but existential. As if reality itself was pressing down on him, reminding him how small he truly was. Finally, they reached the throne room. The doors were 50 meters tall, inscribed with every battle the Emperor had ever fought. They opened without sound, and Homelander stepped into infinity. The chamber was impossibly vast, its ceiling lost in darkness that might have been void or simply distance. And at its center, seated upon machinery that was half throne and half life support, was him, the Emperor of mankind. Even dying, even entombed, he radiated presence. Not the cheap charisma Homelander had cultivated, but genuine, crushing authority, the certainty of a being who had walked among gods and found them wanting. Homelander felt his knees weaken. He wanted to kneel, to prostrate himself, not from reverence, but from sheer self-preservation instinct. Instead, he stood rooted, unable to move, unable to look away. Then the Emperor spoke. Not with words, his physical voice had long since failed, but with thought that bypassed sound entirely and manifested directly in Homelander's mind. It was like standing at the base of a waterfall trying to hear a single drop. So, another one who believed himself a god. The thought carried amusement, weary and ancient. Homelander flinched as if struck. He tried to respond, but his mind was a chaotic mess of fear and shame and desperate need for approval. The Emperor's consciousness brushed against his with the lightest touch, and Homelander's entire history laid bare. The laboratory, the tests, the murders, the rapes, the fragile ego held together with violence and applause. Broken from birth, the Emperor observed. Made weapon without being made warrior. Given strength without wisdom. You are what happens when power precedes purpose. There was no judgment in the words, only statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. And now you come to me, seeking validation from yet another father figure, seeking permission to exist. Homelander's voice cracked. I just want to matter. I want to be necessary. Necessary. The Emperor's thought carried echoes of bitter laughter. Do you know how many billions have uttered that same plea? How many warriors, scholars, priests, madmen have stood where you stand now, begging to be found worthy? The presence in Homelander's mind intensified, pressing, probing. The difference is they were willing to become worthy, to sacrifice, to change. Are you? Homelander wanted to scream yes, to promise anything, but a lifetime of narcissism made the words stick in his throat. I don't know how to change, he admitted finally, the confession barely a whisper. I don't know how to be anything but this. For a long moment, the Emperor was silent. Then, honesty. Unexpected. The presence withdrew slightly, giving Homelander room to breathe. Very well. You will have your chance to matter, to become necessary. But understand, this is not mercy. This is pragmatism. You are a weapon, and my Imperium needs weapons. You will be broken down and reforged. You will serve, or you will be discarded. There will be no third option. Homelander nodded frantically, relief flooding through him despite the harsh terms. Yes, I'll serve. I'll do whatever. Silence. The command was absolute. You do not yet understand what you've agreed to, but you will learn. The Imperium is an excellent teacher. It educates through fire and loss and endless war. And when you finally understand the true cost of being necessary, the Emperor's thought carried something that might have been pity. We shall see if you still consider it a gift. The Custodians moved as one, surrounding Homelander again. Arkan's hand settled on his shoulder, not roughly, but with immovable finality. Come, he said, your education begins immediately. As they led him from the throne room, Homelander glanced back one final time. The Emperor remained motionless upon his throne, a corpse that ruled galaxies, a god sustained by sacrifice. And Homelander realized with creeping horror that this was his future, to become necessary by becoming nothing, to serve until service consumed him entirely. The doors closed with a sound like fate sealing, and in the darkness of the antechamber, the robed figure from before materialized for just an instant, visible only to Homelander. Its smile was triumphant. Welcome, it whispered, to damnation by inches. Then it vanished, leaving only the echo of laughter that might have been Homelander's own. The chamber they brought him to was deep within the palace's sublevels, far from the gilded halls and sacred reliquaries. It was a space of function, not beauty, walls of bare adamantium, the air cold and recycled, the only light coming from dim luminators that cast everything in sickly yellow. In the center of the room stood a device that Homelander couldn't immediately identify. A cradle of brass and cables surrounded by monitoring equipment and attended by robed tech priests whose augmetic eyes glowed red in the gloom. "What is this?" Homelander asked, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Arkan gestured toward the device. "Compliance assessment. We must understand what you are before we can determine what you might become." He paused. "This will be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable how? Homelander's instincts screamed danger, but he was trapped, boxed in by custodians, with nowhere to run that wasn't crawling with Imperial forces. The tech priest who answered spoke in a voice that was more synthesizer than human, each word accompanied by a clicking of gears. "The device will interface with your neural pathways, catalog your capabilities, and establish psychic baseline. It is necessary to determine if you are compatible with the Imperium's operational parameters." Homelander's jaw tightened. "And if I'm not compatible?" The tech priest tilted his head, servo motors whirring. "Then you will be rendered down for component materials. Your unique biological structure may provide valuable data for future projects." He said it with the same inflection one might use to discuss the weather. "Get in the cradle," Arkan commanded. "Do not resist. Resistance will be interpreted as hostility, and hostility will be met with immediate termination." Homelander looked at the custodian, searching for any hint of mercy or flexibility. He found only unwavering resolve. Slowly, hands trembling despite his best efforts to control them, he approached the device and lay down in its embrace. The moment he settled, restraints snapped into place, not physical bonds, but magnetic fields that locked his body in position with invisible hands. He jerked instinctively, and pain lanced through his nervous system, a warning. The tech priest loomed over him, cables in hand. "This will hurt," he said matter-of-factly. The human nervous system was not designed to interface with Mechanicus technology. Your enhanced biology may provide some resistance, but ultimately, the machine will have its communion. "Wait," Homelander started, but the tech priest was already moving. The first cable pierced his temple with a sound like wet meat tearing, burrowing through skin and bone to nestle against brain tissue. Homelander screamed, his heat vision firing reflexively, but the magnetic field bent the beams harmlessly into the floor. The second cable entered at the base of his skull, the third his spine. By the fifth, Homelander had stopped screaming and begun whimpering. Data flooded the monitors. The tech priests chanted in binary, their voices rising in excitement as information scrolled past faster than human eyes could track. Cellular structure, unprecedented regenerative capability. Energy output exceeds theoretical maximum for biological systems. Evidence of exotic particle manipulation. The Omnissiah's mysteries are boundless. Inside the device, Homelander felt his consciousness being pulled apart like meat from bone. The machine rifled through his memories, his fears, his darkest secrets, cataloging everything with dispassionate efficiency. He saw his life played back in fragments. The laboratory where he'd been born, the first time he'd killed someone, a scientist who'd called him subject, the desperate need for approval that had driven every action since. The machine examined it all and found it lacking. Subject analysis, psychological profile, unstable, narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. Recommendation, remedial conditioning. The words appeared on every screen simultaneously. Arkan read them without expression. Can it be conditioned? One tech priest turned, his augmetic eyes whirring as they focused. Possible, but not guaranteed. Subject possesses formidable mental resistance born from extreme self-delusion. We could break him, that is simple, but creating a functional tool from the remains would require significant effort. Then make the effort, Arkan said coldly. The Emperor has declared him potentially useful. We do not question his judgment. The tech priest bowed. As you command. He turned back to the device and began adjusting settings. The change was immediate. Homelander's back arched as electricity coursed through the neural interface. Not enough to damage, but far more than enough to cause agony. His scream was ragged, desperate, animal. Beginning psycho-conditioning protocol, Theta 7, the tech priest announced. Subject will be exposed to Imperium doctrine, battle cant, and loyalty conditioning in accelerated sequence. Estimated duration, 72 hours. 72 hours. 3 days of this hell. Homelander's eyes rolled back in his head as information began pouring in, not gently, but like a fire hose aimed at his consciousness. Images of the Emperor's glory, of space marines dying in heroic sacrifice, of worlds burning for the sin of heresy, words in High Gothic, in battle cant, in languages that shouldn't exist, all hammering against his psyche with relentless force. The Emperor protects. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt. Ignorance is strength. Obedience is freedom. You are nothing. The Imperium is all. Serve, serve, serve. The mantras repeated, overlapping, drowning out his own thoughts. Homelander tried to hold on to himself, to maintain his sense of identity, but it was like clutching smoke. Every time he thought, I am Homelander, the machine countered with, you are subject, you are tool, you are expendable. And beneath it all, threading through the indoctrination like poison in blood, was the robed figure's whispered promise. This is what you wanted, to be necessary, to matter, to be loved. But this wasn't love. This was violation, reprogramming, the systematic destruction of self in service of something greater, or something that claimed to be greater. Homelander wept, tears streaming down his face to pool in the cradle's grooves, and the machine noted his distress with clinical detachment before adjusting pain thresholds to maintain optimal consciousness. Hours blurred together. Sometimes he was aware of custodians entering to observe his progress. Sometimes tech priests made adjustments, their mechanical hands probing his skull with the care one might show a malfunctioning servitor. Sometimes he hallucinated, seeing Vought executives morphed into inquisitors, seeing Madeline Stillwell wearing a custodian's armor, seeing himself crucified on the imperial Aquila while crowds cheered his suffering. And through it all, the mantras continued. The Emperor protects. You are his weapon. Your will is his will. Individual desire is heresy. Obey, obey, obey. On the second day, something inside him broke. Not his will, that had fractured in the first 6 hours, but something deeper. The core belief that he was special, that he deserved better, that the universe owed him worship. It cracked like glass, and through the fissures poured a terrible clarity. He was not special. He had never been special. He was a product, manufactured and disposable, and his only value was what he could offer to something greater than himself. The realization should have destroyed him. Instead, it brought an unexpected relief. If he wasn't special, then the burden of maintaining that illusion was gone. If he was just a tool, then tools didn't need to be loved. They only needed to function. The weight of expectation, of constant performance, lifted slightly. He gasped, the sound wet and broken, and for the first time in days, the pain seemed bearable. The tech priest monitoring his vitals noted the shift. Subject experiencing breakthrough, psychological resistance declining, continue protocol. The conditioning intensified. Now it wasn't just doctrine being forced into his skull, but operational parameters. How to identify heretics, how to prioritize targets, how to accept orders without question, how to kill not from rage or ego, but from necessity, how to become, in essence, an imperial weapon. By the third day, when they finally extracted the cables and released the magnetic locks, Homelander didn't immediately fly away or attack. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, his expression blank. Archon approached cautiously, halberd ready. Subject Homelander, do you understand me? Homelander's eyes focused slowly. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but steady. Yes, my lord. The honorific came automatically, drilled in through 72 hours of repetition. Archon nodded. Stand. Report your purpose. Homelander rose on shaking legs. His suit was stained with blood and other fluids, his hair matted, his perfect face gaunt and hollow. But when he spoke, there was something new in his voice. Not enthusiasm, but something close to resignation, masquerading as loyalty. I serve the Emperor. I am his weapon. My purpose is to destroy his enemies and protect his people. The words came smoothly, as if he'd been saying them his entire life. Do you believe this? Archon asked, studying him intently. Homelander hesitated. In that pause, Archon saw the truth. He didn't believe it. Not yet. But he wanted to. Desperately. Because the alternative, that everything he'd endured was for nothing, was too terrible to contemplate. I will believe it, Homelander said finally. I will serve until I believe it. Archon considered this for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. That is sufficient. Belief born from service is more reliable than service born from belief. You will be watched. You will be tested. And at the first sign of regression to your previous behavior, you will be terminated without hesitation. Do you understand? I understand, my lord. The words tasted like copper and shame, but Homelander spoke them anyway. What choice did he have? The custodian turned to his brothers. Remove him to the penitent quarters. Assign a detail to monitor him continuously. Notify the Inquisition that we have a potential asset for field testing. As they led him away, gently this time, no longer restraining him, but guiding. Homelander caught his reflection in a polished section of wall. The face staring back was his own, but changed, hollowed out. The arrogance gone, replaced by something that resembled humility only because true humility had been tortured into him. He looked away, unable to bear his own gaze. In the darkness of his new quarters, alone for the first time in days, Homelander curled into a ball and shook silently. Not crying. He had no tears left, just trembling with the aftershocks of trauma and transformation. And in the back of his mind, barely audible, the robed figure's whisper returned. "You're welcome." The conditioning had worked. He would serve. He would obey. He would be necessary. And in becoming necessary, he had finally, irrevocably, stopped being himself. The Imperium had claimed another weapon, and this one, for all its flaws, might actually prove useful. The penitent quarters were Spartan even by Imperial standards. A cell 3 meters square, walls of unadorned rockcrete, a sleeping pallet that was more stone slab than bed, and a single drain in the corner for waste. No window, no decoration, no comfort. Homelander sat on the edge of the pallet, staring at his hands. They looked the same as always, strong, unblemished, capable of crushing steel. But they felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. The door opened without warning. Homelander's head snapped up, instincts screaming to attack, to defend. But the conditioning held him in place. A figure entered. Not a custodian this time, but a woman in the austere robes of the ecclesiarchy, her face severe, her eyes carrying the fervent light of absolute faith. She carried a data slate and a small wooden box, both of which she set on the floor before regarding him with open disdain. "Subject Homelander," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "I am Canoness Helith of the Order of the Bloody Rose. I have been assigned to complete your indoctrination into Imperial service." She gestured to the data slate. "This contains the entirety of the Imperial Creed. You will memorize it, all 6,000 pages. Recitation begins in 12 hours. Failure is not acceptable." Homelander swallowed. 12 hours for 6,000 pages? Helith's expression didn't soften. "You possess enhanced cognition." The tech priests confirmed this. 12 hours is generous. Do not disappoint the Emperor." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. You are forbidden from using your abilities without explicit authorization. Flight, heat vision, enhanced strength, all are to remain dormant unless ordered otherwise. This is not a request. Compliance ensures continued existence. Defiance ensures cessation." "I understand," Homelander said quietly. The Canoness studied him for a moment longer, as if searching for deception. Finding only exhaustion and fear, she nodded curtly and departed. The door sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss, and Homelander was alone again. He picked up the data slate with trembling hands. The screen illuminated, displaying dense high Gothic text, prayers, canticles, histories of the Emperor's divinity, regulations governing faith and duty. 6,000 pages. Homelander felt something close to despair welling up, but he pushed it down. He'd been given a task, and completing tasks was how he stayed alive now. He began to read. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the data slate. The words blurred together, a liturgy of devotion and sacrifice that painted a picture of the Imperium as humanity's last bulwark against annihilation. It was propaganda, obviously. Even in his broken state, Homelander could recognize that. But it was effective propaganda. Every page hammered home the same message. Individual lives meant nothing. The Imperium meant everything. And service unto death was not just expected, but glorified. He read about St. Celestine, who had died and returned to lead the faithful in battle. About the Space Marines, who knew no fear and accepted suffering as sacrament. About ordinary humans, guardsmen, servitors, even children, who gave their lives willingly for the Emperor's vision. And slowly, insidiously, the message began to take root. Not because he believed it, but because he had nothing else left to believe in. When the 12-hour mark arrived, the door opened again. Canoness Healith entered, accompanied by 2 battle sisters in full power armor, their bolters held ready. "Stand," Healith commanded. Homelander obeyed, his legs stiff from sitting so long. "Recite the first passage of the Imperial Creed. Begin." Homelander closed his eyes, pulling the words from memory. "The Emperor of mankind is the light and the way, and all his actions are for the benefit of mankind, which is his people. The Emperor is God, and God is the Emperor, so it is taught in the Lectitio Divinitatus, and above all things, this is true." He opened his eyes. "I can continue, if required." Healith's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, in her gaze. "You memorized it." "All of it," Homelander confirmed. "Do you want me to prove it?" For the first time, the Canoness's facade cracked slightly. She almost smiled. Almost. "That will not be necessary. Your retention capabilities are adequate." She gestured to the wooden box she'd brought earlier. "Open it." Homelander knelt and lifted the box's lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a pendant, simple, unadorned, bearing the Imperial Aquila. He stared at it, unsure of its significance. "This is your first test," Healith explained. "Take the pendant. Wear it. It is a symbol of your allegiance to the Emperor, but understand, it is also a monitoring device. The moment you deviate from acceptable parameters, it will alert us, and we will come." Homelander lifted the pendant with careful reverence, as if it were a venomous serpent. The metal was cold against his skin as he fastened it around his neck. Immediately, he felt a faint tingling, not painful, but present, a constant reminder that he was being watched. "Good," Healith said. "Now follow me. Your field training begins." They led him through corridors that seemed to stretch for kilometers, past chapels where the faithful chanted their devotions, past armories where weapons that could crack planets rested in blessed silence, past training halls where aspirants dueled with blades that crackled with power fields. Everywhere Homelander looked, he saw purpose, order, people who knew their place and found pride in filling it. It was everything Vought had pretended to be, but never was. Genuine belief instead of corporate theater. They emerged onto a combat deck, a vast, open space where servitor-operated targets moved along predetermined paths. Waiting for them was a figure Homelander recognized from the indoctrination, an inquisitor, resplendent in black and red, his rosette gleaming on his chest. Beside him stood a hunched, robed figure who radiated wrongness, a sanctioned psyker, Homelander realized, his conditioning supplying the term automatically. "Subject Homelander," the Inquisitor said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I am Inquisitor Valen of the Ordo Hereticus. I will be overseeing your evaluation. If you prove useful, you will be deployed against the Emperor's enemies. If you prove unstable," he smiled thinly. "Well, let us hope that does not occur." He gestured to the targets. "Demonstrate your capabilities. Destroy the targets. Precisely. No collateral damage. Begin." Homelander stared at the moving targets, crude mannequins shaped vaguely like humans. His heat vision itched behind his eyes, begging for release after days of enforced dormancy. But the pendant around his neck pulsed a warning, and he hesitated. "I said, begin," Valen repeated, his tone hardening. Homelander let the heat vision flow. The beams lanced out, impossibly precise, threading between moving targets to strike only those designated. One after another, the mannequins exploded into molten slag. In 10 seconds, all 30 targets were destroyed, and nothing else had been touched. He blinked, cutting off the power, and waited. Valen nodded slowly. Adequate control, better than expected. He made a notation on his data slate. Now, strength test. The servitor to your left is carrying a weight of approximately 10 metric tons. Lift it overhead, without damaging the servitor. The request was absurd. Why would precision matter when lifting something so heavy? But Homelander didn't question. He approached the servitor, a shambling cyborg that stared at nothing with dead eyes, and gripped the weight carefully. It was a solid block of adamantium, dense and unyielding. He lifted smoothly, the muscles in his arms barely straining, and held it overhead for the required 3 seconds before setting it down gently. The servitor didn't even sway. "Impressive," Valen murmured. "Flight capability. Take to the air. Maintain hover at exactly 50 meters. Do not deviate." Homelander lifted off the deck, his body responding instinctively to his will. He rose smoothly, felt the air thinning around him, and stopped at precisely 50 meters. Below, the psyker extended one gnarled hand, and Homelander felt pressure against his mind. Not invasive, but testing, probing his defenses. He held steady, neither attacking nor fleeing, until the psyker lowered his hand. "Psychic resistance, moderate," the psyker croaked, his voice like rusted hinges. Not a blank, but natural mental fortitude enhanced by conditioning. "Will resist casual possession, but remain vulnerable to concentrated assault." Valen made another notation. "Acceptable. Descend." Homelander returned to the deck, landing softly. He stood at parade rest, a position the conditioning had drilled into him, and waited for further orders. Valen circled him slowly, like a merchant appraising livestock. "You have power," the Inquisitor said finally. "That was never in question. The question is whether you can be trusted to wield that power in service to the Imperium rather than your own ego." "I serve the Emperor," Homelander said automatically. The words came easier now, smoothed by repetition and fear. "My ego is irrelevant." Valen stopped in front of him, eyes narrowing. Is it? Tell me, subject Homelander. If I ordered you to kill a child, would you do it? The question hit like a physical blow. Homelander's mind reeled, instinct screaming to reject the premise, to refuse, to rebel. But the conditioning whispered in the back of his thoughts. Obedience is survival. Hesitation is death. The Imperium's will is absolute. If the child was a threat to the Imperium, Homelander heard himself say, then yes, I would eliminate it. Valen smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. Good. You're learning. He turned to Canoness Helith. He may be salvageable after all. Continue the indoctrination. I want him ready for deployment within the week. He paused. And monitor him closely. The moment his conditioning shows signs of failure, I want to know immediately. As you command, Inquisitor, Helith replied. Valen departed, his retinue following. Helith gestured for Homelander to follow her back to the quarters. You did well, she said, and it might have been the first praise Homelander had heard since arriving on Terra. The Inquisitor is not easily impressed. If you continue to demonstrate competence and obedience, you may yet earn a measure of autonomy. Thank you, Canoness, Homelander said quietly. He meant it. The praise, hollow as it was, felt like water in a desert. It terrified him how desperately he craved approval from these people who saw him as nothing more than a weapon to be pointed at enemies. Back in his cell, alone again, Homelander sat on the pallet and stared at the pendant around his neck. The Imperial Aquila gleamed faintly in the dim light. He traced its outline with one finger, feeling the strange comfort it provided, proof that he belonged to something, even if that something viewed him as expendable. I serve the Emperor, he whispered to the empty room. I am his weapon. He repeated it like a mantra, letting the words fill the hollow space where his identity used to be. I serve. I obey. I am necessary. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen and patient, the robed figure smiled. The transformation was nearly complete. 6 days passed in a blur of training, indoctrination, and constant surveillance. Homelander learned to move with imperial precision, to speak only when spoken to suppress every instinct toward individualism in favor of collective purpose. The Custodians watched him with the patience of eternal guardians. The Battle Sisters corrected his recitations with sharp reprimands. The tech priests monitored his biosigns with obsessive detail. And through it all, the pendant around his neck hummed its quiet warning. You are owned. On the 7th day, Canoness Helith entered his quarters without preamble. You're being deployed, she announced. Inquisitor Valen has requisitioned your service for an operation in the Outer Hive. There's a cult uprising, followers of the Dark Gods spreading heresy and corruption. You will accompany a strike team and eliminate the threat. Homelander stood immediately, hands clasped behind his back. I am ready, Canoness. Helith studied him for a moment, her stern expression softening infinitesimally. This is not a test, subject Homelander. This is an actual mission, real heretics, real danger. If you fail, people will die. If you succeed, she paused. You may begin to earn the trust you seek. I won't fail, Homelander said, and he meant it. not because he cared about the mission or the Imperium's goals, but because failure meant rejection, and rejection meant the conditioning would start again. He'd endure any mission if it meant avoiding another 72 hours in the neural cradle. They outfitted him simply. No armor, no weapons, just his own body and the pendant. The Imperials understood that he was most effective unencumbered. A squad of battle sisters would accompany him, along with Inquisitor Valen and his retinue. They boarded a Valkyrie transport, its engines screaming as they lifted off from the palace's landing platforms and banked toward the outer hive. Through the viewport, Homelander watched terror scroll past below, an endless sprawl of Gothic architecture and industrial decay, millions upon millions of souls packed into a world that could barely sustain them. It should have inspired disgust or pity. Instead, he felt only detachment. These weren't people. They were resources, assets to be protected because the Imperium needed them, not because they had inherent worth. The conditioning had taught him that, and he no longer had the energy to resist it. The Valkyrie descended into a hive district choked with smoke and despair. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, held upright by prayer and rust. Gangs of enforcers battled cultists in the streets, their laser guns flashing in the gloom. And above it all, spray-painted on every surface in luminous paint that seemed to writhe, the 8-pointed star of chaos. Target location is 300 meters ahead, the pilot's vox crackled. Be advised, heavy resistance expected. The cult has fortified the central spire and is holding hostages. Inquisitor Valen stood, his plasma pistol drawn, his expression calm. Sister Superior Morgwen, your squad will establish a perimeter. Psyker Torin, remain at my side and watch for warp disturbances. He turned to Homelander. You will breach the spire and neutralize all cult members. Prioritize hostage preservation, but do not hesitate if they are too compromised. Chaos taint spreads quickly. Understood, Homelander said. The Valkyrie's ramp dropped and he stepped out into the madness. The sound hit him first, screaming, gunfire, the wet crunch of improvised weapons tearing through flesh. Then the smell. Blood, excrement, something sickeningly sweet that his conditioning identified as warp corruption. Cultists surged toward the Valkyrie, their eyes wild, mouths chanting prayers to gods that should not be named. Homelander moved, not with rage this time, but with clinical efficiency. His heat vision swept across the charging cultists, cauterizing them at the neck so cleanly their heads toppled from their shoulders without a drop of blood spilled. He flew forward in a blur, fists striking with surgical precision. One punch per target, each strike calculated to kill instantly without excessive damage. In 15 seconds, 30 cultists lay dead, and Homelander hadn't broken stride. The Battle Sisters advanced behind him, bolters barking as they systematically purged the remaining heretics. Morgwen's voice came through the vox. Subject Homelander, breach achieved. Spire entrance is clear. Proceed to upper levels. Homelander crashed through the spire's entrance, his body shattering the reinforced door as if it were glass. Inside, the corruption was worse. Walls covered in flayed skin, arranged in profane patterns. Altars built from bone and still beating hearts. The air thick with incense that made his eyes water. Hostages hung from chains, some weeping, others laughing with the vacant ecstasy of the mad. A cult leader stepped forward, tall, emaciated, his flesh carved with symbols that glowed with sickly purple light. "Ah," he purred, his voice resonating with unnatural harmonics. "The Imperium sends its dog. How delightful." He raised skeletal hands, and the air bent. Homelander felt pressure against his mind, whispers in languages that predated sanity, promises of power and freedom and release from suffering. The conditioning held. Barely. Homelander gritted his teeth and launched himself forward, but the cultist was faster, or the warp made him so. Chains erupted from the walls, wrapping around Homelander's limbs, burning with cold that seeped into his bones. He struggled, heat vision lashing out wildly, but the chains absorbed the energy and tightened further. "You are broken," the cultist whispered, circling him. "I can taste it in your soul. The Imperium has hollowed you out, made you a vessel for their hypocrisy. But we could fill you with truth, with purpose, with—" Homelander headbutted him. The cultist's nose shattered, and the psychic hold wavered. Homelander tore free of the chains, grabbed the heretic by the throat, and squeezed. "I serve the Emperor," he growled, the words coming automatically. "Your lies have no power here." The cultist's eyes widened in genuine surprise before Homelander's grip crushed his windpipe. He dropped the corpse and turned to the hostages. Some were too far gone, their eyes reflecting warp taint that no amount of purification could cleanse. Others were merely terrified. Homelander made the calculations coldly, which could be saved, which must be purged. He killed 11 hostages, saved 9. When Inquisitor Valen arrived minutes later, he surveyed the scene without expression. "Report." Cult leader eliminated. Hostages assessed. Those beyond redemption were granted the Emperor's mercy. Homelander's voice was flat, empty. He didn't feel guilt. The conditioning had stripped that from him. But he felt hollow. Valen nodded. "Acceptable losses. The mission is complete." He stepped closer, studying Homelander's face. "You killed, without hesitation, without remorse. That's progress." "I did what was necessary," Homelander replied, "for the Imperium." And he believed it. Or at least, he believed that he should believe it, which amounted to the same thing. Valen smiled thinly. "You're learning your place, Subject Homelander. Continue this trajectory, and you may yet become valuable." As they flew back to the palace, Homelander stared at his hands. They were clean. He'd been efficient enough to avoid spatter, but he could still feel the ghost of the hostages' throats collapsing under his grip. 11 people who might have been saved, killed because the Imperium deemed them compromised. And he'd done it without question, because that's what weapons do. They obey. The realization should have horrified him. Instead, he felt only exhaustion. This was his life now. This was what necessary meant. The robed figure had promised him purpose, and he'd found it, at the cost of everything that made him human. In the darkness of his quarters that night, Homelander knelt before the simple Aquila mounted on his wall and recited the prayers Helith had taught him. The words were empty, but emptiness, he'd learned, was easier to bear than the weight of self. And somewhere in the warp, something ancient and patient fed on his despair and smiled. The missions continued. Each one was a test, a measurement of his compliance and capability. Homelander was deployed against Orc raiders in the Underhive, where his heat vision carved through greenskin hordes with the efficiency of an industrial laser. He was sent to purge a Genestealer cult in the Water Reclamation District, his strength tearing apart hybrids that would have butchered normal humans. He stood alongside Adeptus Astartes during a demonic incursion, his invulnerability allowing him to hold a choke point while the Space Marines enacted their ritual of banishment. With each mission, his conditioning deepened, not through additional sessions in the neural cradle, those had ended after the first week, but through the insidious power of habit and necessity. He learned that obedience brought approval, however small. He learned that questioning orders led to suspicion and renewed surveillance. He learned that the easiest path forward was to simply stop thinking about who he'd been and focus entirely on what he was becoming, a tool. The Imperium noticed his progress. Inquisitor Valen submitted reports praising his effectiveness. Canoness Helith noted in her logs that his recitations of doctrine had become automatic, requiring no conscious effort. Even Captain Arkan, who remained skeptical, admitted that the subject designated Homelander had not shown signs of relapse. But none of them saw what happened in the darkness of his cell when the missions ended and he was alone with his thoughts. Homelander would sit on his pallet, staring at the walls, and feel the slow erosion of everything he'd once been. His memories of Earth, of Vought, of Madeline, of the adoration of crowds felt distant, unreal, like stories someone had told him about a stranger. The man who'd craved worship now craved only the absence of pain. The god who demanded love now wanted nothing more than to be told he was adequate. And the most terrifying part was that he could feel himself accepting it. The resistance was fading. The voice in his head that had once screamed in defiance now whispered suggestions of compliance. "It's easier this way," it said. "No more pressure to be perfect. No more fear of exposure. Just do what you're told and endure." On the 40th day of his service, Homelander was summoned to a chamber he'd never seen before, deep in the palace's sublevels, past security checkpoints that made even custodians submit to verification. The room was circular, its walls inscribed with wards that made his skin prickle with undefined unease. In the center stood Inquisitor Valen, Canoness Helith, Captain Arkan, and a fourth figure, a towering space marine in the grey armor of the Grey Knights, his armor covered in purity seals and litanies of banishment. "Subject Homelander," Valen began without preamble. "You have served adequately for 40 standard days. Your combat effectiveness is undeniable. Your compliance has been consistent. The time has come to determine your permanent assignment." He gestured to the Grey Knight. "This is Brother Captain Alaric of the Grey Knights, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus. He has reviewed your performance and made a recommendation." Alaric stepped forward, his voice resonating through his helm's vox grill with a depth that seemed to reach into Homelander's chest. "You possess formidable power, Subject Homelander, power that could be instrumental in the war against chaos. However, your psychological fragility remains a concern. The ruinous powers specialize in exploiting weakness, and you are profoundly weak in spirit." He paused, letting the words sink in. Therefore, I propose a test, a final evaluation to determine if you can be trusted with deployment against the arch-enemy. Homelander's throat tightened. What kind of test? Alaric's helm turned toward a sealed door at the chamber's far end. Beyond that door is a single demon, bound within a psychic cage. It is not powerful, merely a lesser horror of the warp, but it is cunning. It will attempt to corrupt you, to exploit your fears and desires. You will stand before it alone and resist. If you succeed, you will be deemed worthy of continued service. If you fail, he let the sentence hang. If I fail, Homelander pressed. Valen answered, his tone clinical. If you show signs of corruption, we will purge you immediately, painlessly, if possible, but purge you we must. He met Homelander's eyes. Do you accept this test? Every instinct screamed at Homelander to refuse, to run, to blast his way out of this chamber and flee terror entirely. But the conditioning held him frozen, and beneath the panic, a quieter thought emerged. This is your chance. Prove you're worthy. Prove you matter. I accept, he heard himself say. The Grey Knight nodded once. Enter the chamber. Stand before the cage. Do not speak to the demon. Do not listen to its promises. Endure for 10 minutes, and you will have passed. He gestured, and the sealed door hissed open, revealing darkness beyond. Homelander stepped through, and the door sealed behind him with a finality that made his pulse quicken. The chamber was cold, not physically, but spiritually, a chill that seeped into his soul. In the center, suspended in a cage of shimmering psychic energy, was the demon. It was small, no larger than a child, its flesh a shifting mass of colors that hurt to look at directly. Eyes that were not eyes opened across its surface, each one focusing on Homelander with predatory interest. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of whispers, some male, some female, some neither. Ah, a visitor. How delightful. The demon pressed against the cage, its form rippling. And such an interesting visitor. So much pain, so much need. You're hungry, aren't you, little godling? Starving for something these corpse worshippers can't provide. I'm not listening to you, Homelander said, clenching his fists. The conditioning's mantras rose automatically. The Emperor protects. The demon's words are lies. Resist. Endure. The demon giggled, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, but you are listening. You have to. It's part of the test, isn't it? Stand here for 10 minutes and pretend I don't exist. But I do exist, little godling. Just as your pain exists, your loneliness, your desperate, pathetic need to be loved. Homelander's jaw tightened. Shut up. They broke you, didn't they? The demon's tone shifted, becoming almost sympathetic. Strapped you down, poured their doctrine into your skull until you couldn't remember who you were, turned you into a weapon and called it salvation. But we both know what it really is. Slavery. I'm not a slave, Homelander said, but the words lacked conviction. I serve by choice. Do you? The demon's form shifted, and for an instant, Homelander saw his own face reflected in its flesh. Hollow-eyed, broken, wearing the expression of a whipped dog. Is it choice when the alternative is annihilation? Is it freedom when you're monitored every moment, when one wrong thought means death? You've traded one cage for another, little godling. At least, Vought let you pretend to be a god. The words dug into him like barbs. Homelander closed his eyes, focusing on the mantras. The Emperor protects. I am his weapon. I serve. I endure. But beneath the conditioning, doubt spread like poison. The demon was right. He wasn't free. He was a prisoner who'd learned to love his chains because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I can give you freedom, the demon whispered, its voice honeyed and warm. Real freedom, not servitude disguised as purpose, but genuine choice. The dark gods do not demand obedience. They offer opportunity. Join us, and you could be what you were always meant to be. Worshipped, adored, perfect. Homelander's eyes snapped open. I'd become a monster. The demon laughed. You already are a monster, little godling. The only difference is who you're monstrous for. The Imperium uses your monstrosity to maintain its tyranny. We would let you use it for yourself. Which is more honest? The question hung in the cold air. Homelander's mind raced, grasping for counter-arguments, for the conditioning's prepared responses. But they felt hollow, because the demon wasn't lying. Not entirely. He was a monster. He'd always been a monster. The only thing that had changed was the leash. 5 minutes remaining, a Vox speaker crackled from somewhere overhead. Halfway done, Homelander forced himself to breathe, to focus. The demon sensed his wavering resolve and pressed harder. They're watching you right now, you know, judging whether you're worth keeping. And when they finally decide you're not, when you fail some test or show some flaw, they'll kill you without hesitation. Is that what you want? To be discarded like garbage after giving them everything? Homelander's voice cracked. I don't know what I want anymore. Yes, you do, the demon purred. You want what you've always wanted, to be seen, to be valued, to matter. The Imperium will never give you that. To them, you're just ammunition. But to us, you could be so much more. The offer was seductive in its simplicity. Homelander felt himself swaying, felt the conditioning's grip loosening, as doubt corroded its foundations. It would be so easy to accept, to embrace the darkness and finally stop pretending to be something he wasn't, to be the monster openly instead of hiding behind duty and doctrine. 2 minutes remaining. Homelander looked at the demon, really looked at it, and saw beyond the shifting flesh to the hunger beneath. It was ancient and patient and utterly devoid of anything resembling care. The demon didn't want to free him. It wanted to consume him, to add his suffering to its collection. The Imperium might treat him as a weapon, but at least weapons had purpose. The demon offered only annihilation disguised as liberation. No, Homelander said quietly. The demon's eyes widened. What? No, Homelander repeated, stronger now. You're lying. You don't offer freedom. You offer oblivion. I'd rather be a weapon with purpose than a slave to my own worst impulses. The words felt strange in his mouth, as if someone else was speaking them. but they were his. Perhaps the only genuine choice he'd made since arriving on Terra. The demon shrieked, its form convulsing within the cage. "You fool! You'll never be anything but their dog." "Maybe," Homelander agreed, "but at least I'll be a dog that bites the right targets." The Vox crackled. Time elapsed. Test complete. The door hissed open, and the chamber beyond was flooded with light. Homelander walked through, his legs shaking, and found the assembled observers watching him in silence. Alaric spoke first. "The demon attempted corruption. You resisted. Why?" Homelander met the Grey Knight's gaze. "Because I'd rather serve something greater than myself than serve nothing at all." The words tasted like ashes, but they were true, or true enough. Alaric nodded slowly. "Acceptable." He turned to Valen. "The subject is cleared for deployment against Chaos forces, with supervision." Valen smiled thinly. "Welcome to the war, Subject Homelander. May you prove useful until the end." And in his heart, Homelander felt the final piece of his old self crumble and fade. He was no longer Homelander, hero of Earth. He was Subject Homelander, weapon of the Imperium. The transformation was complete. The warship Eternal Vigilance hung in the void above a world designated only as Sigma-7, a backwater planet whose primary value to the Imperium was its position along a stable warp route. Recent reports indicated Chaos cultist activity in the planetary capital, and the Inquisition had deemed the threat severe enough to warrant immediate intervention. Homelander stood in the deployment bay, surrounded by the quiet bustle of an Imperial strike force preparing for war. To his left, a squad of Tempestus scions checked their hotshot laser guns with mechanical precision. To his right, Sister Superior Morgwen led her battle sisters in hymns of divine wrath. And directly ahead, Inquisitor Valen conferred with a servo skull that projected tactical holograms into the air between them. This was Homelander's first deployment off-world, his first mission beyond Terra's relative safety. He should have felt excitement or dread. Instead, he felt only the cold focus that the conditioning had drilled into him. Mission parameters, threat assessment, acceptable casualty ratios. Valen turned to address the assembled forces, his voice amplified by the bay's Vox speakers. "Our objective is simple. Purge the heretical presence in the capital city of Sigma-7. Intelligence suggests a cult dedicated to Khorne has taken root, and their rituals are destabilizing the local warp. If left unchecked, a demonic incursion is likely." He gestured to the hologram, which displayed a sprawling urban center surrounded by manufactoria. "We strike fast, eliminate the cult leadership, and withdraw. Collateral damage is authorized. The Emperor's justice is absolute." Morgwen raised her chainsword. "For the Emperor!" The battle sisters echoed her cry, their voices blending into a hymn of zealotry. The scions remained silent, their discipline absolute, and Homelander, standing apart from both groups, simply nodded when Valen's gaze settled on him. "Subject Homelander," the Inquisitor said, "you will deploy with the first wave. Your objective is to draw the cultists' attention and create an opening for our ground forces. You are not to deviate from this plan. Understood?" "Understood, my lord," Homelander replied. The honorific came automatically now, no longer requiring conscious thought. The dropship shuddered as it detached from the Vigilance and began its descent toward Sigma-7. Through the viewport, Homelander watched the planet grow from a gray marble to a sprawling landscape of industrial decay and polluted skies. It reminded him of Terra, but smaller, quieter, as if the galaxy's weight pressed less heavily here. The city came into view, smoke rising from dozens of fires, streets choked with panicked refugees, and at the center, a towering cathedral defaced with the 8-pointed star of chaos. 30 seconds to drop, the pilot's vox crackled. Homelander stood, checked the pendant around his neck by habit, and moved to the deployment ramp. Behind him, the Scions and Sisters prepared their own descent. The ramp dropped with a hiss of hydraulics, and wind screamed into the bay. Without hesitation, Homelander stepped off and fell toward the war-torn city below. He didn't bother with subtlety. His body arrowed downward at terminal velocity, heat vision igniting as he neared the ground. The beams carved through a cluster of cultists who'd been herding civilians toward makeshift altars, their bodies flash vaporized before they could scream. Homelander landed in the center of the street with enough force to crater the pavement, dust and debris exploding outward in a shockwave. Cultists surged toward him from every direction, men and women twisted by Horn's influence, their skin covered in blasphemous runes, their eyes burning with mindless rage. They wielded chain axes and autoguns and improvised weapons that dripped with blood and worse substances. Homelander met them without emotion. His fists moved in practiced patterns, each strike calculated to kill instantly and conservatively. One punch per target, minimal energy expenditure, maximum efficiency. Within 60 seconds, 40 cultists lay dead, and the street was painted with their blood. Homelander stood amid the carnage, breathing steadily, and waited for the next wave. It came quickly, a mob of hundreds pouring from the cathedral's defiled entrance, screaming prayers to their blood god. Behind them, something larger stirred. A bloodletter, its brass blade gleaming with unnatural light, its horned head swiveling to fix on Homelander with predatory focus. The demon charged with supernatural speed, blade raised for a killing stroke. Homelander met it head-on, catching the blade mid-swing. The metal burned his hands, not with heat, but with warp taint, and he felt the demon's rage pressing against his mind like a physical weight. The conditioning held. He twisted, using the demon's momentum against it, and hurled it into the cathedral wall hard enough to shatter stone. The bloodletter rose, ichor dripping from a dozen cracks in its brass armor. It didn't speak. Demons of Horn rarely did, but its fury was palpable. It charged again, faster this time, and Homelander met it with heat vision. The beams punched through the demon's torso, cauterizing warp flesh, and it stumbled. Homelander closed the distance, grabbed the demon's head with both hands, and squeezed until it popped like overripe fruit. The body dissolved into ash, and the brass blade clattered to the ground. A vox crackle in Homelander's ear. "Subject Homelander. Excellent work. Hold position. Ground forces are landing now." Homelander acknowledged the order and took up a defensive stance near the cathedral entrance. Around him, the surviving cultists hesitated. their bloodlust warring with basic survival instinct. He could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that they'd summoned a demon and watched it die in seconds at the hands of something they couldn't understand. The Tempestus Scions dropped from Valkyries overhead, their grav chutes deploying in perfect synchronization. They hit the ground already firing, hotshot las cutting through cultists with surgical precision. The Battle Sisters followed, bolters roaring hymns of destruction. And finally, Inquisitor Valen descended on a personal grav lift, his plasma pistol holstered, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Secure the cathedral," Valen commanded. "Ensure no cultist escapes. If they resist, grant them the Emperor's mercy." The words Emperor's mercy meant summary execution, a fact everyone present understood. Homelander moved with the strike force, his role now that of enforcer and shield. Cultists who emerged from hiding were gunned down by Scions or incinerated by his heat vision. Those who tried to flee were run down and executed without trial. It was efficient, brutal, and utterly in line with Imperial doctrine. Inside the cathedral, the corruption was overwhelming. The walls wept blood. The pews had been rearranged into crude fortifications soaked in gore. And at the altar, surrounded by still beating hearts, arranged in profane geometry, knelt the cult's leader, a woman whose body had been warped by chaos, her limbs elongated, her face a mask of ecstatic madness. She looked up as Homelander approached and smiled. "You are empty," she said, her voice layered with unnatural harmonics. "I can see it. A shell filled with someone else's will. How tragic. How perfect." She laughed, the sound echoing strangely. "Kill me then. Add me to your count. But know that you're no different from us. We both serve masters who devour us whole." Homelander raised his hand, heat vision charging. "The difference," he said quietly, "is that my master built civilization. Yours only destroys it." He fired. The cult leader's body vaporized, her laughter cutting off mid-breath. The hearts on the altar stopped beating simultaneously, and the oppressive weight of chaos lifted slightly from the cathedral. Valen stepped forward, studying the scene. "Clean work. The corruption is purged." He turned to Homelander. "You performed adequately. This is noted." "Thank you, my lord," Homelander replied automatically. They exited the cathedral to find the city largely secured. Scions were rounding up survivors for questioning, while sisters moved through the streets sanctifying the ground with prayers and promethium. Smoke rose from dozens of pyres where the dead, cultist and civilian alike, were being burned to prevent warp taint from spreading. It was efficient, thorough, and absolutely soulless. As the dropships returned to ferry them back to the Vigilance, Homelander stood apart from the others, watching the city burn. He felt nothing, not pride in a job well done, not guilt for the lives taken, not even the satisfaction he'd once derived from violence. Just numbness. The conditioning had stripped away his capacity for emotional response, leaving only the mechanical execution of duty. "You're adapting well," a voice said beside him. Homelander glanced over to find Canoness Helith standing nearby, her armor scored but intact. Too well, perhaps. I've seen veterans with decades of service show more humanity than you do now. "Is that a problem, Canoness?" Homelander asked. Healith was silent for a moment. I don't know, she admitted. The Imperium needs weapons, and you're proving to be an effective one. But weapons without souls are just tools, and tools break. She met his gaze. Remember that you were human once, even if it's just a memory. Otherwise, what's the point of saving humanity? Homelander didn't have an answer. Healith walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts, or the hollow space where his thoughts used to be. He boarded the dropship and sat in silence as it lifted off, the burning city shrinking below until it was just another scar on another world in an imperium of endless scars. The war continued, and Homelander, subject Homelander, went with it. Months blurred together in a haze of deployments, debriefings, and endless war. Homelander became a fixture of Inquisitor Valen's retinue, deployed to dozens of worlds across the segmentum. He purged heretics on ice worlds and jungle death worlds, stood against xeno's incursions alongside Astartes chapters, and once even fought a rogue psyker whose power had turned an entire hive into a waking nightmare. With each mission, his efficiency improved, his kill count climbed, and his capacity for independent thought diminished. The Imperium was satisfied. Reports filtered up through the inquisitorial hierarchy, praising the effectiveness of subject Homelander, noting his reliability and compliance. There was talk of creating more like him, finding other powerful beings from other realities and binding them to service through similar conditioning. Homelander heard these discussions but felt no opinion about them. If the Imperium wanted more weapons like him, that was the Imperium's choice. He existed to serve, not to question, but something was changing. Subtle, imperceptible to his handlers, perhaps, but undeniable to Homelander himself. The numbness that had insulated him from the horrors of his service was beginning to crack, not shattering, not yet, but fracturing in small ways. A moment of hesitation before killing a surrendering cultist, a flicker of disgust when ordered to burn a refugee camp suspected of harboring genie-stealer hybrids, a dream, the first in months, of Earth, of sunlight, of a world where his greatest concern was maintaining his public image. He tried to suppress these feelings, recognizing them as threats to his conditioning. But they persisted, growing stronger with each deployment. It came to a head on a world called Pythos during an operation against an Emperor's Children warband that had enslaved the local population for their depraved rituals. The battle itself was routine. Homelander breached the Chaos Marine's fortress, his invulnerability allowing him to shrug off bolter fire and power weapon strikes that would have annihilated normal humans. He killed methodically, efficiently, until only the warband's leader remained, a towering champion whose armor was decorated with the screaming faces of his victims, whose voice was silk over razors. "You're magnificent," the Chaos Lord purred as they circled each other in the fortress's throne room. "Such power, wasted on corpse worshippers who will never appreciate you. Join us. Slaanesh offers pleasures beyond your imagining. Freedom from the chains you don't even realize you wear." "Not interested," Homelander said flatly, launching himself forward. The combat was brief and brutal. The Chaos Lord was skilled, enhanced by dark gifts, but Homelander's raw power overwhelmed him. Within minutes, the heretic lay broken on the floor, his armor cracked, his augmetics sparking. Homelander stood over him, preparing the killing blow, when he noticed something. In the corner of the throne room, chained to the wall, was a child. A girl, no more than 10, her body covered in cuts and brands, her eyes vacant with trauma. The Chaos Lord had been using her as a plaything, a source of suffering to feed his patron god. She stared at Homelander, and for the first time in months, he saw something other than fear or reverence in someone's eyes. Hope. The Chaos Lord laughed wetly, blood bubbling from his lips. Go on. Kill me. But what about her? Will you save her? Or will the Imperium deem her tainted and order her purged? You know the answer, dog. You know what they'll make you do. Homelander's hand froze, because the Chaos Lord was right. The girl had been exposed to heresy, had witnessed unspeakable corruption. By Imperial doctrine, she was compromised. The safest course of action, the one his conditioning demanded, was to grant her the Emperor's mercy alongside every other survivor. Quick, clean, no risk of taint spreading. But she was a child, a victim. And as he looked at her, something inside him, something he'd thought the conditioning had killed, stirred. Rage. Not the petulant fury of his old self, but righteous anger at a universe so broken that murdering innocents counted as mercy. No, Homelander whispered. The chaos. Lord's eyes widened. What? No, Homelander repeated, louder. He drove his fist through the Chaos Lord's skull, ending him instantly, then turned to the girl. He approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm, and began working at her chains. They were warp-forged, resilient, but his strength was sufficient. They broke with a screech of tortured metal. The girl collapsed into his arms, too weak to stand. It's okay, Homelander heard himself say, the words foreign and awkward. I've got you. You're safe now. It was a lie. Nobody was safe in the Imperium, but it felt necessary. The girl looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Thank you." Those two words hit harder than any blow Homelander had ever taken. He carried her from the fortress, past the bodies of Chaos Marines and enslaved workers, out into the ash-choked air of Pythos. The Imperial forces were mopping up resistance. Inquisitor Valen stood near a command chimera, reviewing casualty reports. He looked up as Homelander approached, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of the child. "Subject Homelander," Valen said carefully. "That child is a survivor from the fortress?" "Yes, my lord." "She's been exposed to heretical influence. Protocol requires—" "She's innocent," Homelander interrupted. The words surprised him as much as they surprised Valen. Around them, scions and sisters paused in their duties, sensing something significant happening. "She's a victim, not a threat." Valen's expression hardened. "That is not your determination to make. You are a weapon, Subject Homelander. Weapons do not question orders." He gestured to a nearby sister. "Take the child. Administer the Emperor's mercy." The sister moved forward, bolt pistol drawn, and something inside Homelander snapped. "No." He stepped between the sister and the girl, his body language shifting from submissive to protective. "I won't let you kill her." The reaction was immediate. Every weapon in the vicinity swung toward Homelander. Scions raised their hotshot lass. Sisters leveled their bolters. Even Valen drew his plasma pistol, the weapon humming to life. "Stand down," the Inquisitor commanded, his voice cold. "That is an order." Homelander met his gaze, and for the first time since his conditioning, he felt fully present, fully himself. "I'm done taking orders that make me a monster," he said quietly. "I've killed enough innocents for your Imperium. Not this one. Not her." Valen's finger tightened on the trigger. "You're relapsing. The conditioning has failed. This is unfortunate." He aimed carefully. "May the Emperor have mercy on your soul." Time seemed to slow. Homelander saw the plasma pistol fire, saw the superheated bolt of energy lance toward him. He could dodge, easily, but that would mean dropping the girl. So instead, he turned, shielding her with his body, and took the blast full in the back. The pain was excruciating. His invulnerability held, but plasma burned hotter than anything he'd faced, and even his enhanced flesh blistered under the assault. He gasped, stumbling but not falling, and looked down at the terrified child in his arms. She stared up at him with wide eyes, unharmed. "Run," he told her. "Go. Find somewhere safe." She hesitated, then scrambled from his arms and disappeared into the ruins. Homelander straightened slowly, smoke rising from the charred crater in his suit, and faced the assembled Imperial forces. They stared at him in shock, not because he'd survived, but because he'd chosen to save the heretic rather than obey. "You've made your choice," Valen said sadly. "Eliminate him." The world erupted in fire and fury. Homelander moved, no longer constrained by obedience or doctrine. He wasn't fighting to kill. He'd had enough of killing, but to escape. His heat vision carved escape routes through rubble. His strength hurled vehicles into pursuers. His flight carried him skyward, faster than Valkyries could follow. Behind him, Pythos became a distant grey marble. Ahead, the void stretched infinite and cold. And somewhere in between, Homelander, not subject Homelander, but simply Homelander, flew alone, free for the first time in months, and utterly uncertain of what came next. The conditioning had broken. The weapon had remembered it was human, and the Imperium would never forgive that. The void was not kind. Homelander drifted through the black, his body slowly repairing the plasma burns, his mind struggling to process what he'd done. He'd rebelled, rejected the Imperium's authority, saved one child at the cost of everything he'd built, or been forced to build. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like falling. Without a ship or supplies, survival became immediate priority. He hijacked a small cargo hauler adrift between systems, its crew already dead from void exposure. The ship's cogitators were barely functional, but they provided enough navigation data to identify nearby worlds. Homelander chose at random a border world, far from Terra's light, where Imperial authority was thin and questions were few. The world was called Castra, a frontier settlement clinging to existence on the edge of known space. When Homelander descended from orbit, he found a town of prefab habs and struggling agri-domes, populated by colonists who looked up at his arrival with the weary suspicion of people who'd learned not to trust anything that came from the sky. He landed in the town square, no crater this time, no dramatic entrance, and simply stood there, unsure what to do. A crowd gathered slowly, keeping their distance. Finally, an older man stepped forward, his face weathered by harsh suns and harder living. "What do you want?" the man asked bluntly. Homelander opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I don't know." It was the most honest thing he'd said in months. The man studied him for a long moment. "You running from something?" Homelander nodded. "Yeah, I'm running." "Imperials?" Another nod. The crowd murmured, some fearful, some sympathetic. The old man sighed. "Throne's sake, we don't need trouble here. We barely survive as is." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Homelander said. I need somewhere to think." The man considered this, then gestured toward a dilapidated building at the edge of town. "Empty storehouse. You can stay there, short term, but first sign of Imperial attention, you leave. Understood?" "Understood," Homelander agreed. "Thank you." He moved into the storehouse, which was little more than 4 walls and a roof. It was quiet, empty, perfect. For the first time since arriving in the 40K universe, Homelander had space to simply exist without orders, without surveillance, without the constant pressure to perform. It should have been peaceful. Instead, he felt lost. Days passed. Homelander didn't interact with the townspeople beyond necessary exchanges. He spent his time sitting in the storehouse, staring at his hands, replaying the moment he'd chosen defiance over obedience. The conditioning whispered that he'd made a mistake, that he was worthless without purpose. But a newer, quieter voice insisted he'd done the right thing. The conflict exhausted him. On the 5th day, a child appeared at the storehouse door, different from the girl he'd saved, but similar in age. The boy held a plate of food, simple rations that probably cost the family dearly. "Grandpa said you might be hungry," the boy said, setting the plate down carefully. "He also said you're not bad, just sad." Homelander stared at the food, then at the child. Why would he think that? The boy shrugged. "He says sad people do angry things sometimes, but anger goes away when you're not sad anymore." He paused. "Are you gonna stop being sad?" "I don't know," Homelander admitted. The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense, then left. Homelander ate slowly, tasting the food, really tasting it, for the first time in months. It was bland, nutritionally adequate, but nothing more. It was the best meal he'd ever had. Weeks passed. The town cautiously accepted his presence. He helped when asked, lifting equipment too heavy for normal humans, repairing structures with heat vision precision, even defending the town once when raiders approached. But he never demanded gratitude or worship. He simply did what needed doing, then returned to the storehouse. And slowly, incrementally, he began to remember who he'd been before Vought, before Terror, before everything. Not the narcissistic God complex he'd cultivated, but the child beneath it, the one who'd been tested and measured and told he was special while never being treated as human. That child had wanted love. Genuine connection. The adult he'd become had forgotten how to receive either. One evening, the old man who'd first questioned him appeared at the storehouse. "Imperials are asking questions 2 systems over," he said without preamble. "About a rogue asset, man who can fly, shoot lasers from his eyes. Sound familiar?" Homelander's stomach dropped. "I need to leave." "Probably," the man agreed. "But I wanted to ask first, why'd you run? What'd you do that made the Imperium want you dead?" Homelander was silent for a long time. "I saved a child," he said finally. "They wanted to kill her. I stopped them." The old man's expression softened. "That's it? That's what made you a rogue?" "That's it." The man shook his head in disgust. "Throne's sake. The Imperium really is as rotten as the stories say." He pulled a data slate from his coat. "Here, coordinates to a smuggler's route. Follow it, you can disappear into the outer dark, where even the Inquisition won't find you easily. It's not much, but it's a chance." Homelander took the slate, his throat tight. "Why help me?" The old man smiled sadly. "Because someone who saves children doesn't deserve to die for it, even if the Imperium disagrees." He turned to leave, then paused. "You're not what you think you are, son. You're not a monster. You're just tired. Remember that." That night, Homelander left Castra. He followed the smuggler routes deeper into the void, jumping from system to system, always one step ahead of the Inquisition's hunters. He didn't know where he was going or what he'd do when he got there. But for the first time since falling into this nightmare universe, he felt something other than emptiness. Hope. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was his, and that made it worth everything. Years would pass. The Imperium would eventually stop hunting him actively, categorizing him as a minor lost asset rather than an active threat. Homelander would drift through the dark spaces between stars, occasionally helping when he encountered those in need, but never staying long enough to form attachments. He was free, but freedom in the 40K universe was just another word for alone. And in the deepest void, where even the Astronomican's light couldn't reach, Homelander sometimes wondered if he'd made the right choice. But then he'd remember the girl on Pythos, the hope in her eyes, and he'd know. He'd chosen to be human instead of a weapon. In a galaxy that demanded constant sacrifice, that small act of defiance mattered. He was Homelander, not a hero, not a god, not a tool, just a man, trying to find redemption in a universe that had no word for it, and that, somehow, was enough. The stars turned, the Imperium endured, and one lost weapon flew on, searching not for purpose, but for peace.